Let's talk about monofilament versus fluorocarbon. There's a lot of different ideas about fluorocarbon that I think are misplaced. And what I'd like to do is go through some of the properties attributed to fluorocarbon that are either not very important or actually don't exist. And then we'll compare it to monofilament, and we'll discuss when we ought to maybe be using monofilament and when we ought to be using fluorocarbon. There's certainly a place for both tippets or leader materials in a person's fishing arsenal. But the fluorocarbon has some serious disadvantages which people, I think, should be aware of. So what we've done here is I've got two flies, identical prince nymphs. They're both exactly the same fly. And both of them are tied on different materials. The one on my right hand and on your left is monofilament. The one on your right or my left is fluorocarbon. They're both 3X and they're both 0.008, because that's what 3X is. And one of the things we're going to notice first off, I'm going to have the camera zoom back in again in just a second. So we'll do that first, and I want you to look at the suppleness of the two materials. I think you can see that the monofilament in the right hand, my right hand on your left, is much more supple than the fluorocarbon on your right. You can see the curvature here. It takes a lot longer for it to bend than here. So one of the differences between fluorocarbon and monofilament is the degree of suppleness. And now there may be some other materials, and certainly they're getting better and better as time goes on. But at this point in time, most fluorocarbon material is not as supple, given the same diameter and the same X as monofilament, which I think is a significant disadvantage, which we'll talk about in a minute, especially in some applications. So let's take another look at something. We're going to zoom in a second. What we're going to do is show you a little bit about the visibility of fluorocarbon versus monofilament. And one of the things you've heard, and the makers of fluorocarbon always push when they're selling fluorocarbon, is the invisibility factor. And I think what we're going to see is we're going to stick these things in this wine glass in just a second and zoom in on them. And you're going to see that absolutely there is very little difference between fluorocarbon and monofilament in terms of visibility. If you don't believe me, duplicate this experiment by yourself. Certainly there isn't a significant enough difference that a fish can't see it. The biggest difference is that, and I don't believe that fish are leader shy, so I think fluorocarbon has absolutely nothing to do with leader shyness. Fish can see a giant hook, they can see the bead on these things. That doesn't look anything like any bug in real life. I mean, it may imitate some kind of an air bubble or something, but the bottom line is that fish can certainly see a lot of stuff. What happens, I think, is that the line or the tippet, if the tippet is too big, it affects the way the fly moves. It's not the tippet they can't see, it's the fact that they're turned off by the fact that the fly is moving differently than it should in a natural environment. And that's caused by a piece of tippet that's too big. So if you cut down on your tippet size, the fly now drags the tippet around instead of the tippet dragging the fly around, and you've got a better situation in terms of a more natural presentation. The fact that a fish can't see tippet is ludicrous. A fish can see 8X tippet. If you can see it, a fish can see it. So let's just take a look at the glass, and we'll have you guys, just have you take a look at the visibility of the two different materials. Okay, so take a look. I'm just going to swing these around. And I'll tell you what, I don't think there's any difference between them. Certainly from my point of view, I can see both tippets very clearly. There's no difference between the one tippet and another tippet. Whoops, it's kind of got caught here. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, take a look. So you can see those tippets. Both of them are equally visible or very close to equally visible, and yet one is fluorocarbon and one is monofilament. Another property that's attributed to fluorocarbon is that it sinks faster, and that's true. It's a little more dense, it sinks a bit faster. But I don't think it makes a significant differences in most applications. If you put two pieces, and I've done it quite frequently, we can't really do it here because it takes too much space, but if you were to throw two flies, matter of fact, if I were to come here and take this bowl again, and it's a little bit deceptive because the flies are going straight down, but if I hang these two things up, and don't worry about it if you don't see it exactly, but you're going to see these flies, watch, they're going to hit the bottom at about the same time. Now, true, they're going vertically, and if they were horizontal, it would be slower. But I've done a lot of studies on a horizontal plane, and I can just tell you that the sink rate is not significant enough that it makes a huge difference. So I wouldn't worry too much about the sink rate. It may be an advantage at some point in time. One of the other factors that is attributed to a fluorocarbon, which is I think the most important factor, and that is fluorocarbon. There's two factors in fluorocarbon. The fact that it is more abrasion resistant is absolutely true. I always use fluorocarbon in an application where I'm fishing for toothy fish, around oysters, mussels, pile-ons, fish with tough scales like snook, those kinds of things. You're going to be way better off with fluorocarbon because it absolutely is superior to monofilament in that application. The other application is because it doesn't stretch. Monofilament stretches, whereas fluorocarbon stretches considerably less. And the other thing about fluorocarbon, it doesn't rebound, which is an advantage and a disadvantage of the material. The advantage of not stretching very much is that when I do a strip set on a fish when I'm streamer fishing, there's a direct line from my hand when I strip to the fly. The point of the fly is going to penetrate. There's no flex, there's no spring in here that's going to allow that fly to penetrate more slowly. It's going to be very sharp. So for instance, you're fishing for tarpon, you definitely want to have a fluorocarbon, I think, because you're going to have way less stretch. It's going to make a harder snap into the fish. The problem is that because it doesn't stretch, it is a little less, its breaking strength is different. Even though the breaking strength, if you were to hang 8 pounds on this 3X and hang 8 pounds on the 3X of fluorocarbon, they would break at about the same rate, let's say 8 pounds, 10 pounds, or whatever. But if you pop it, boom, if you pop it, it's more likely to break, fluorocarbon is more likely to break than monofilament because it doesn't have that elasticity in it. The elasticity is a serious advantage in terms of break strength, which also has to do with the knot strength. Fluorocarbon does not tie because it's not as supple, it doesn't tie as tight a knot, and it's not as strong, at least in my view, and I've seen some studies that support that, but I think there are probably some people who disagree with that. But for the most part, I can't see a fluorocarbon knot being as strong as a monofilament knot because it isn't as supple. And then of course the flexibility or the stretch in it, the elasticity in the fluorocarbon is an advantage in some applications but a disadvantage in others. I use fluorocarbon when I'm streamer fishing because I'm going to use 0x tippet or 20-pound test tippet or whatever, and I figure, hey, at 20 pounds, I mean, I can hit a fish pretty hard that weighs 7 or 8 or 9 pounds and not break my tippet. So I'm going to use that a lot because I want that hard set. I want to have that zero elasticity that just bam, my hand to that fish, just yank, and it's in his mouth. When I don't use fluorocarbon is for smaller nymphs, smaller dry flies. We'll talk about dry flies and gurglers and poppers in a second. But don't use, at least I don't use fluorocarbon on smaller stuff because of the lack of suppleness, the lack of knot strength, and the fact that it's not going to move as well because of the suppleness. So when I'm using size 18, 20, 22, 24 nymphs, I'm using monofilament. In those applications, there's very little reason to be using fluorocarbon, and I don't think the sink rate is that important compared to the other things that I give up by having fluorocarbon. One thing we want to make sure we do when we're floating flies, remember that fluorocarbon will sit in a surface film or even break the surface film much more readily than will, or maybe not much more readily, but somewhat more readily than monofilament. So we want to make sure that when we're using gurglers and poppers and dry flies, we're using monofilament. Now, one thing I've discovered is even in saltwater fishing, if I'm fishing with fluorocarbon, which I do quite often, and I set the hook, and that's my go-to thing that day, and then all of a sudden I see some kind of a bunch of fish working on the surface and I want to go to gurglers or to poppers, then what I'm going to do is I keep a little bottle of dry fly floating like I use in Wyoming, and I take that little bottle and I coat my fluorocarbon leader. That will give me a number of casts where my leader is going to sit on top of the surface film and create a much better action on a part of that gurgler or that popper than it would if I were just using straight fluorocarbon. And it saves me the time of not having to change tippets or change leaders. So that might be a little trick you can use. So in closing, I don't think there's a real problem with using fluorocarbon. I use fluorocarbon quite frequently, but not nearly as often as a lot of people do. So you'll have to decide what application is going to be best served with fluorocarbon versus monofilament. And then you're going to have to decide. I don't think it makes a big difference. Fluorocarbon costs a bit more money, but one of the advantages of fluorocarbon we didn't mention so far is that fluorocarbon doesn't rot in the sun. It's got a half-life that's just seriously long, which is an advantage in that you can keep it for years and not have to worry about replacing it. Also, old spools can last a long, long time. The disadvantage from an environmental point of view and from a conservation point of view is that if you lose a bunch of fluorocarbon out in the wilderness, it's going to be there for a long time. So fluorocarbon, I think, should be used judiciously for a lot of reasons. But I do think there's a use for fluorocarbon. So have at it. I hope this little video helped kind of make a little bit of put some clarity in people's minds about the differences between fluorocarbon and monofilament and the advantages and disadvantages of both.